Welcome to Unlapped. Katie George alongside Lawrence Edmondson, Nate Saunders. It's pretty hard to host a podcast about such a boring sport. I just wish, something newsworthy would happen from every now and then. What do you guys do? Lawrence, you just sit over there and twiddle your thumbs all day?
Yeah, that was my plan after Silverstone, was just to sit back, relax, and not really do anything. Unfortunately, my plans got ruined. Although, to be fair, I've got to say, Nate carried most of the burden of the news this week, and I actually did do a bit of thumb twiddling as well. So, yeah, but it's been great, hasn't it? I mean, Daniel Ricciardo back in F1. We suspected it might happen, but I don't think any of us thought it would be so soon as this.
Yeah, absolutely wild. I mean, I think what was crazy about it as well was this is one of those stories that genuinely seem to develop over about a 48, 72-hour window, where somebody goes from thinking one thing to thinking another. So, yeah, brilliant news. And I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about it in great detail now. It might just, I kind of was thinking this earlier, Red Bull, the story of the season is quite dull. It's quite one-sided. I think they've single-handedly saved at least the next kind of couple of weeks, just giving us something to dig our teeth into and speculate wildly about. So kudos to Red Bull for doing that, because, Max doing an amazing job out front, but it's getting harder to talk about Red Bull and not just be repeating the same points. So yeah, credit to them.
It feels like silly season has kind of come early. Obviously, Nick de Vries is no longer with AlphaTauri. That move was made earlier this week based on Daniel Ricciardo's lap in the Red Bull, apparently at Silverstone. He really impressed, showed that he still has a bunch of promise in this sport. Kind of walk me through, Nate, just how things unfolded. A call was made that basically was the nail in the coffin for Nick de Vries.
Yeah, it was. It all seems like that part of it all seems to have happened quite quickly. But I think this was kind of death by a thousand cuts for Nick de Vries. I think this was coming for about a week. If you kind of look at what Marco said, I mean, we've talked about it, haven't we, over and over again. He wasn't exactly Nick de Vries' biggest fan, which is ironic because he's the guy that basically signed Nick de Vries off the basis of one very good performance in Italy last year. It seems that originally de Vries was told he had until Zandvoort, his home race, which is, the race after the summer break. That very quickly changed to Austria and Britain. And I think as soon as Ricciardo became aware of that and aware of the fact that de Vries was most likely on his way out, I think it coincided perfectly for Ricciardo with the fact that he'd been preparing for this Silverstone test. I've been told by him, by people close to him, he was treating that test as an audition really for a bigger role within the team, a race seat. At the same time, he's starting to think, I do kind of miss driving. I miss racing. He's at all these races. He's doing a lot of media commitments. And I think that, if you're doing that and you're as competitive as these Formula One drivers are, it must have been pretty painful to be sat there watching this. You're in the team kit. You kind of, after a while, start to feel like, well, I'm just here doing all this media stuff. I'm not really racing. I think that started to grate on him a little bit. And it coincided with this opportunity being there for AlphaTauri. And I think the big thing was that it was very, very clear to Ricciardo that this could be it. This could be the one foot in the door moment you're going to get. If you turn this down now, and Liam Lawson, who's one of the only Red Bull Junior drivers left outside of F1, if he comes in, does a good job, I think Red Bull would look at that and say, well, this guy's doing well. You've already turned down the opportunity once. Why do we give it to you again? So I think by Sunday of Silverstone, I spoke to him on Saturday. I just saw him very briefly and had a quick chat. I think by then he kind of knew. I think looking back at the conversation I had with him, it was quite brief, but I think he said one or two things that I should have followed up with, like, well, there is going to be a seat free by the sounds of it. Yeah, there is a seat coming free, Daniel. He said, like, I am missing the racing, I'm missing the driving. My follow-up should have been, well, I mean, wait around. There's probably going to be a seat free, just over there at that team very, very soon. And then I think that from everything you hear, Monday, I think Ricciardo was calling people, asking them about the AlphaTauri setup, what to expect there. And then Tuesday, the one thing Christian Horner wanted to see is this guy, is this the Ricciardo of a few years ago, or have we kind of got ourselves into a situation where he's still not quite the Ricciardo of old? And from everything we've heard, straight into the car, was immediately quick. I think there was a spin later in the day, but I think he was, he had enough credit in the bank by that point to say, oh, it's just one spin. And I think for Horner, by that point, he called Helmut and said, this is legit, let's go for it. And obviously they don't just make that call out of nowhere. The contracts were already starting to be written up. They'd already had the conversations. And then Nick de Vries gets a very, very blunt phone call, I think, from Helmut Marko saying, thank you, but, we're going to move on from you. And then, all hell broke loose because, the Dutch journalists found out. We started to see, reports leaking through from very credible Dutch journalists. And then before we knew it, there's a press release coming at 3 p.m. Get ready. Danny Rick's in for the season. So really changed very, very quickly. And I think that a lot of things kind of all happen at the same time. I'm very interested to see over the next few weeks how Ricciardo is. I think he's going to be very, very happy the first week or so. He's joining probably the team with the worst car right now in Formula One, and I think that one of the reasons he wanted to stay until 24, and again we can talk more about this now, is that, and we've mentioned it on the pod before, but Red Bull really wants AlphaTauri to have a much closer relationship in 24 with Red Bull. Take much more parts, be much more competitive, be a much more serious team, I think. And Ricciardo really liked the idea of having a preseason with that team and then racing with that team. So he's I think he's had to swallow a bit of that and say that this could be the only chance. He's going into a pretty dire situation. It's not going to be that competitive. And really the only measuring stick we're going to have from the outside is how he's competing against Tsunoda. Obviously, De Vries, I don't think De Vries did that badly against Tsunoda, but I think that he came in with that huge reputation from Monza last year and he just didn't live up to it. And I think it's difficult to live up to it when your car is barely able to make it out of Q1. So that's going to be really interesting to see, but an amazing news story for Formula One. A great story, I think, for everybody except Nick De Vries, who it's difficult not to feel sorry for. He had 10 races and he's just kind of been cut loose. So yeah, fascinating to see how it played out, and fascinating to see what we'll be saying about this move in 6 months, because there's about 6 different outcomes here. I was thinking about them all earlier. That every way you slice it, there's a great outcome in terms of a story. And yeah, I'll let Lawrence talk for a bit, because I've just been waffling on. But yeah, I'm really excited about it for a number of reasons. And yeah, over to Lawrence to continue the hype.
Nate, I just love how excited you are about this. I mean, it's clear that this
is... I had to remind myself I'm on a pod with 2 other people, because it could have just been a long monologue about Danny Ric and Red Bull and how this all came to be.
Well, Nate was named the Ricciardo Whisperer by someone on Twitter, I believe. Was it Twitter or Reddit? Or
it was Twitter, yeah. Somebody said the only source I believe on Ricciardo is Nate, the Ricciardo Whisperer.
Good way to be.
I had to give credit. There's other journalists. I mean, there's been a few other people that that had that news at least bubbling, at the same time. So, but I'll take it. So, if you're going to be a whisperer for anyone, I think Danny Ric's a pretty good one.
I think it's interesting, obviously, what's going to come from this, but I have to agree with you, Nate. I feel for Nick De Vries. This was very much a cutthroat decision. Lawrence, how often have we seen Red Bull cut bait in the middle of the season and release a driver early like this?
Yeah, alarmingly often, certainly more often than any other team. We've seen it with Kvyat. He got ditched a couple of times from Red Bull in 2016, and then again when he was at Toro Rosso, and then he even came back for a one-off race in Austin. I can't remember which year that was.
It was 18, I think, or 19.
Yeah, 2018, I think. And Gasly had to go and race in Super Formula. So, they're not afraid of chopping and changing their drivers. And it is part of what you sign up to when you're a Red Bull driver. And they are all Red Bull drivers as well. So they have 2 teams, AlphaTauri and Red Bull, but you have a Red Bull contract. And what that allows the team to do is to move the drivers between the teams and also bench them and basically push them out of F1 if they see fit. And the person making those decisions is mainly Helmut Marko. There is discussions within the team, but Helmut Marko tends to have the last say on where the drivers end up. And he has depending on which way you look at it, a successful track record, but also a pretty brutal track record. The success is clear from Sebastian Vettel, 4-time world champion, came through the Red Bull Junior system. Max Verstappen, snapped up by the Red Bull Junior system, coming out of Formula 3, and then going on to win his 2 championships, plus God knows how many more he's going to get. So clearly it works when the driver has everything in the right place, but there's been so many examples where it hasn't worked. Jaime Alguersuari, Jean-Eric Verne. If we look at the current grid, Carlos Sainz, Gasly, Albon, all started off in the Red Bull Junior program, all with the aim of getting to the Red Bull senior team. Gasly and Albon got that far, but then came crashing back down again. So it is harsh. And I was looking into De Vries's record, and I think from the outside, you do look at it and it's not great. It's not brilliant, but it's also not terrible. Baku was one race where it all seemed to go wrong. He crashed in one of the qualifyings and then also in the race, and that was a black mark against him. But if you remove those qualifying results from his average against Tsunoda over the course of the year, the gap between the two, including sprint qualifying and qualifying, is 0.22 seconds. Now, that's a gap that, obviously you don't want, but we're only 10 races in. So he was starting to stabilize that gap as well a bit. There were occasions when he was faster than Tsunoda in qualifying. It wasn't a complete whitewash. So, yeah, I feel like on De Vries's pure just results from 10 races and what you might expect from a rookie in that period, he's slightly different as a rookie. He's 28 years old when he came in rather than being a very young rookie. But even so, I don't think he got a fair run at it. Then again, once Red Bull had made this decision that they wanted De Vries out, and it seems quite clear that decision was made several weeks ago, why hang around and make life any more difficult? And especially when Ricciardo had made the decision, it seems, Nate's reporting around Canada made it very clear that he was keen for an AlphaTauri seat next year. So once Ricciardo's made that decision, has changed his mind that he doesn't want or he's got his year off, but he actually wants to really get back in the car. Once you have those two things weighing up, who would you pick, Nick De Vries or Daniel Ricciardo? I mean, I would pick Daniel Ricciardo. So I can see why they've made it, but I just think it is still a harsh kind of reality for Nick De Vries to swallow, just given that his performances weren't dreadful. They weren't great by any stretch, but they weren't dreadful. And he was probably expecting a few more races to prove himself.
I think you could see the writing on the wall as Helmut Marko became more and more vocal that there was an underlying political motive behind it with Daniel Ricciardo waiting in the wings. And obviously it's now come to fruition. Let's be clear, though, the AlphaTauri is not the same machine as the RB19. And both drivers for AlphaTauri, Nick De Vries being one, have struggled in that car this season. So what kind of risk is this, Nate, for Daniel Ricciardo to step into this car? Or is it not so much as what do you give us this season, but what the future will hold, as you said, that they want to be much closer to the AlphaTauri and Red Bull teams in 2024?
Yeah, I think it is a big risk because, as I said, I think Ricciardo really wanted to go in 24. And the reason you don't want to go in now is exactly the reasons you said, Katie. This car, Tsunoda's only got 2 points. Everyone's acting as if De Vries was massively behind. And if you take the most recent example of Ricciardo, when Zach Brown made that call, I mean, Lando was so much further ahead than Ricciardo. That was a case where it was literally apples and oranges that you could compare. Lando was getting, an oranges. I don't know which of the two is orange because obviously that's McLaren's color.
But orange.
Yeah. One of them was different colored oranges. I don't know. I've got myself into a weird hole here. I don't know what I'm talking about. But in that situation, Ricciardo was performing so much worse than his teammate if you compare it to where De Vries was with Tsunoda. So I think it's a real risk, and there's a few reasons why it's a risk for Ricciardo. The first of which being that I think a full season with a improved AlphaTauri, whatever they're going to be called next year, is a much better proposition than this is. He's jumping in. It's so difficult to look good in a bad team, and weirdly, I think this is a perfect scenario for Red Bull. Really, it's a perfect scenario for Red Bull, and it's probably it's good for Ricciardo, but I don't think it's as good as it would have been had he come back next year. The reason I say that is because I think if Ricciardo's decent, if Ricciardo competes at the level we think he's going to, but he's not spectacular, at the very least, Red Bull get a good read on Yuki Tsunoda. They're probably, even though they had Pierre Gasly there, who's a race winner, it's pretty clear that Christian Horner and Helmut Marko both really, for whatever reason, soured on him when he went through that Red Bull experience. They never promoted him again. So at the very least, they're going to come out of it and say, we know how good Tsunoda is here. And their best case scenario is he does amazingly, and it puts a lot of pressure onto Perez, and you would expect that Perez makes a step forward. That's obviously what they're hoping for, and we can get more into what it means for Perez, I guess, in a little bit. But if you're Ricciardo, I think that it clearly was AlphaTauri or bust for him. There was no way he was going to go straight to Red Bull. So it's a risk he's going to have to take. And I think that he clearly backs himself to do better than he did at McLaren. So I don't know. That's what I've been trying to mull over in my head, is how big of a risk this is. But really, I think if we're brutally honest about it, I don't think Ricciardo was going to drive anywhere else anytime soon. So you'd rather take on a situation that's risky than be in the situation he was in. So I actually think that he's done the right thing. If it was now or never, even if it is risky, I don't think he's going to have another chance like this. Certainly not with Red Bull now so clearly as his end goal. If he hadn't said that, other teams might have been willing to give him a shot. But I think now he's said that, other teams are like, well, clearly you just want to get back to Red Bull, which is fair. Like who wouldn't want to drive for them right now? But he's kind of nailed his kind of position to the master bit.
Quick follow-up.
I think it would have been, sorry, Kate, I just say on that, I think it would have been a much bigger risk not to take this drive. Because
agreed.
Red Bull clearly had, well, Marko certainly had come to the end of his tether with De Vries and the results he was getting. Liam Lawson is also available, doing a pretty good job in Super Formula. He didn't really impress in F2 during his 2 seasons in it, but Liam Lawson, who's the next in line in the Red Bull Junior program, is second in the Super Formula Championship. I mean, I think Red Bull would like to see him go and win that in total. But of course, if you were to say to Liam Lawson, what would you rather do, finish your Super Formula Championship or jump in an AlphaTauri? He'd jump in an AlphaTauri. So Daniel, I think, had to take it from that point. If he had just said, "Oh no, give it to Liam," then I think he'd probably write off next year as well. So I don't think he had any choice, and much bigger risk to turn around and say no at this stage.
And also, there's there's been rumors, obviously, before De Vries, they wanted Herta was the guy that was in there. But if you look at IndyCar right now, the guy leading the championship is Alex Palou, and I think there's definitely been some interest there from the Red Bull side. So if you are Ricciardo, obviously you're lucky this year that the IndyCar season kind of runs until about September, October time. But if they sign Palou in the off season or before next season, it's the same situation. You've kind of the doors slammed in your face. So I really think he had to do it. There was no other way.
Was there discussions about Daniel Ricciardo taking the AlphaTauri seat at the end of 2022, or was that option not an availability for him?
From my understanding, it was not fully on the cards, but I mean, I think that they'd have been stupid to have taken the Red Bull thing and not asked, right? I mean, sorry, Lawrence, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I agree. I think Daniel had made his position clear that he didn't intend to race in 2023, and he made that quite clear relatively early on, long before Nick de Vries got signed up. And when we were in the Dutch Grand Prix, and because basically this all started because Fernando Alonso decided that he was going to leave Alpine and go to Aston Martin. Which, I mean, who else would be at the bottom of all this? And then, that meant that Pierre Gasly had this option to go to Alpine, and Alpine became very set on Pierre over Daniel. Because I think Daniel may have entertained the idea of going to Alpine, but Alpine, who felt like they kind of been burnt by Daniel before when they were Renault, and he left to go to McLaren. They were very much set on Pierre. So once it became clear that Pierre, wanted to leave, and Red Bull were open to the idea of ending his contract a year earlier and letting him go, the original idea was Colton Herta. Super license points didn't look like they were going to come together, didn't ultimately come together. And so they then had to start looking around. And really, Nick de Vries, it was great timing on his behalf. Again, random thing, but Alex Albon's appendix burst, and that's what got de Vries the shot on Monza, and he really did take that. And I think that really absolutely was the thing that got him into that drive. If Daniel had been a serious contender at that point, and had been willing to take the drive of AlphaTauri, then I think AlphaTauri would have absolutely taken him. But Daniel at that stage, I think, was so bruised by his experience at McLaren that the thought of then going to a team that was further down the grid, and ultimately this year has been further down the grid, was just, it just didn't appeal compared to a year off, assessing options and coming back. And I think, if we look at it now, I think that probably was the right decision. One, because he's got into that car anyway, but two, I think he's really benefited from that time off and really put it all in perspective about what he wants and what F1 means to him.
Nate had mentioned this earlier, but as soon as this news was announced, my mind immediately goes to Sergio Perez and how he probably is feeling. Obviously, he's getting results on Sunday, but his qualifying has been a nightmare over the last, 4 or 5 races at this point. What kind of pressure does this add to Sergio Perez, or does it? How do you think he views this move?
I think it's definitely put pressure on him. There's no other way to look at it. I think that it's interesting because I think that the reaction to it was everyone saying, "Oh, Perez, Perez, Perez," and I think it's actually, at this stage, it's still premature to be thinking like that, because I don't think Red Bull see Ricciardo yet as the guy to replace Perez. In 2018, when Gasly was underperforming, we were being briefed, at the time. Red Bull were very clear to us behind the scenes, like, this guy's got to improve, otherwise he's out. When Albon was underperforming, it was clear that there was a tone there of like, these performances just aren't good enough. We're not getting the same with Perez. They are frustrated, but they're seeing signs, in the race that he is performing. It's not like his performances aren't just falling apart all weekend. And I think Christian Horner's convinced that as soon as he sorts out whatever this mental hang-up he's got on these Saturdays is, he'll be fine. But putting Ricciardo there, I think it's a really smart move, because it's a reminder to Perez, like, hey, look, we've got this guy here who's not only at his best is, still considered to be one of the best drivers in Formula One, but is very popular within the team, is, marketing dream. You put Ricciardo in, you don't miss a step. It's not like you promote a rookie that no one's ever heard of. You're putting one of the most popular drivers in the sport in that seat. So it's got to be a warning sign to Perez. I think that it's going to take a lot more for Perez to to get into a bad situation from everything that we're hearing. And I think he's very lucky that he's doing this year, because Verstappen could pretty much win the Constructors' Championship on his own this year. He doesn't really need Perez to be there finishing second. And that weirdly has helped Perez out, because I think if we're in a really tight championship fight, this would really be hurting Red Bull. It's not really hurting them. It's frustrating, but it's not hurting them. So rightly or wrongly, that I think is giving Perez a bit of leeway. But also you've got to look at this from a wider perspective as well. And I think people, they're looking at it from the Red Bull perspective. But if you're Red Bull, the company right now, you're also selling the name of AlphaTauri soon. AlphaTauri won't compete as AlphaTauri next year. They'll compete as another team. They'll have another brand coming in. Red Bull can now turn to that brand and say, presuming Ricciardo stays for a year and a half, which I don't think is that unlikely. Perez has a contract through to the end of 24. You can turn to that brand now and say, that number we've been discussing, double it. We've just put Ricciardo in the car, and he'll be wearing your brand. He'll be promoting everything you're doing. So I think just purely from a business point of view, this has been a genius move from Red Bull, because everyone's seeing it from the Perez perspective, but there's so much beyond it as well from a business point of view as well. So whichever way you slice it for Red Bull, it's brilliant. It's put Perez under pressure. They can ask for more money from the guys coming in at AlphaTauri. So really, they've just covered all their bases. And even if Ricciardo never replaces Perez, there's about 10 different benefits for them, down the line. So I think it's premature, but I think clearly if these next two races, especially, if Perez doesn't perform, the only thing we're talking about going into the summer break is Ricciardo and Perez, because we know now he's right there, and we know how those contracts work, and that he could just be replaced. So very clever from Red Bull. And it'll be interesting now. I think what will be really interesting, we saw how quickly Marco turned against De Vries. We haven't seen that publicly against Perez, but if he does badly at the Hungaroring, really fascinating to see if Marco and Horner come out that aggressively against Perez in terms of what they say, because we haven't seen that yet. And I think you could tell, Horner was saying he's got to have a clean weekend. He'll just have one clean weekend. It'll be fine. If he doesn't have that clean weekend with Ricciardo there now, I think that's when the heat starts to get turned up. So it's definitely pressure, but I think maybe a little bit overplayed at the moment, but that could change really quickly as the Ricciardo situation changed over the past few days.
The move has obviously generated a lot of buzz and multiple rumors. I'm now going to hit you both with rumors that are out there. You can say true, false, or somewhere in the middle and explain why. This
is why F1 silly season is so good.
It's so good. It's so good. The first rumor, Lawrence, that is milling about is that Lando Norris has a pre-contract signed with Ferrari. Where do you fall on that?
I'm not sure about that one. I've seen a few more rumors linking Norris to Red Bull for 2025. Norris has a contract with McLaren that runs through to the end of 2024, as does Sergio Perez. You put those things together and you think, well, possibly there could be a move there. Norris at the moment is looking very good in a McLaren that is improving, but is still a long way off a Red Bull. And I think if you look at the long-term prospects of those two teams, one is significantly better than the other. The question, of course, for someone like Norris would be, or anyone really, looking at that Red Bull seat, would be, would you go up against Max Verstappen? Because right there, right now, you have a team that is, very strong with Verstappen, capable of winning multiple championships with Verstappen, and then you're entering with less experience at the team, less contacts at the team. Jos Verstappen seems to be quite a powerful person within that team as well at times. And that's a tough question for anyone who's considering a Red Bull drive. But the Ferrari one, well, I think that's based also on the idea that Leclerc would be going somewhere else, but would then have to speculate where that would be. Well, maybe to
that's next. Don't you worry.
Okay, well, maybe I shouldn't get too far into it. But I think the other thing that could potentially open up the drive market quite a lot for 2026 onwards is the rival of Audi, and in fact, really in 2025 as well. If you want to get yourself in position, it's no bad thing to be at the team a year earlier than Audi officially come into F1 in 2026. So I think with that becoming an option as well for a number of drivers, it just creates that extra breadth in the driver market for drivers who are looking to mix things up. But most of the contracts are in place for next year already. So I don't think we want to see a huge amount of change coming up immediately. But yeah, I think a number of people are already looking towards 25 and then the regulation change in 26. And really with a regulation change, we've seen so many times before, drivers, can make or break careers depending on where they end up around those and the championships they can fight for afterwards. So I'll let Nate take on the where Leclerc's heading once he decides he's had enough of Ferrari.
So just to be clear, you believe Lando Norris heading to Red Bull is more likely than Lando Norris ending up in a Ferrari in the future, correct?
Yeah, I think so, and that's slightly based on them having conversations in the past. Christian Horner joked maybe a year or two ago that every time they had conversations with Norris, he went and signed a McLaren contract the next day. But there has been contact in the past, and there is kind of interest. But yeah, the question would just be, from Norris's point of view, is do you want to go up against Max in the same car, or would you rather try and take a punt on a different team in the hope that they can up their level and compete, team to team rather than within a team?
Nate,
he does have a vowel at the end of his name. So if you're looking at a Ferrari guy, he's got the O at the end of the name. Sounds Italian. Let's do it.
That's exactly what they'll base it on. What they'll base it on.
I hope so. I mean, Ferrari, you've got two drivers without a vowel, ending their name. I mean, come on, what's going on here?
Yeah, we'll see
anyway,
what we can do.
Casey.
See what we can do with that.
Yeah.
Do you think that Charles Leclerc would be interested in being Max Verstappen's teammate in the future? Because the next rumor that I hit you with is that Charles Leclerc has been linked with Red Bull. They're clearly searching for the two best drivers on the grid to be an RB, whatever number you want to throw on in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I could see it. And I think things have flipped around. For years, the most coveted seat in F1 was to be Lewis Hamilton's teammate, but at the same time, it was also the most difficult job in Formula One. But I think every driver backs themselves to be the guy that breaks that, makes it, a one-sided thing. And, Russell's done a pretty good job against Hamilton in the same way. And I think Leclerc would back himself. He'd say, I'm a race winner. I've raced Max. I've beaten Max. So I don't think he'd be scared of that move at all. And I don't think Max, I think people have this idea that Max would block moves, but I really don't think Max really would care who his teammate is, because he's so comfortable at that team. I don't think there's any, like Lawrence said, his dad and his manager have a bit of sway in the team. Helmut Marko's kind of Mr. Verstappen. So I don't think he'd really care who's coming in. So Leclerc to Red Bull, if that option was open to him, Red Bull would take it. I think Charles would be silly not to at least entertain it. So yeah, I think that's maybe, who knows? I mean, Charles still seems somehow to be clinging onto some hope with Ferrari, but Red Bull, I could totally see him being at least interested. I mean, why wouldn't you be?
And
is Charles at the level? Yeah.
No, go on, Katie.
I was just going to say, is Charles at the level he would need to be next to Max in the same car?
I think over one lap, he's absolutely at the level. I think what we've not seen is whether he's got the consistency and the ability to keep it all together in races to sustain a championship challenge against someone like Max Verstappen, who has become so much more complete. I mean, it's a lot easier when when you do have the fastest car by some margin, because you can just take a few percentage points off each corner and take it a little bit easier. But even in the midst of the early season battle with Leclerc and Max last year, before things got all a bit one-sided, Max looked like the more complete driver of the two. Those were the days too. But what I was going to say is, for any of these drivers, if your contract is up in 2025 and there are opportunities at other teams, you would, if your manager is not talking to those other teams to at least find out what the possibilities are, then sack your manager. They're not doing their job. So, these conversations happen all the time. Sometimes they don't go much further than, just a question of what's available, what's your thinking on this guy or whatever. But yeah, if they're not having some kind of just, quiet conversation, nothing official, behind the scenes, then I think I'd be very surprised, really, because that's something that happens a lot in F1. And the other thing with Leclerc is that he's been asked a number of times recently, "Oh, you're not worried about getting your next Ferrari contract lined up and in place," because he signed a very long one the previous time round. And he, on a number of occasions, just said, "No, I'm not focusing on that at the moment. Just trying to get the car back into its position." Meanwhile, Carlos Sainz seems a little bit more keen to talk about getting into conversations with Ferrari and stay there. And I think that says a lot about those two drivers and how committed they are to the Ferrari project long term. I think with Leclerc, he would entertain maybe the possibility of going somewhere else, whereas Carlos, I think, knows that probably Ferrari is a good thing for him, as it would be for any driver. But I think they have to keep their options open, certainly until until you've got a knowledge of who's going where and which seats going to be available.
I think it also speaks to the fact Sainz probably knows that it's unlikely he's going to get many better offers in terms of, I'm not sure Red Bull are going to go back to him. I'm not sure Mercedes will. I think Leclerc can probably kind of not name his price, but he's definitely a much stronger candidate. So I think for him, waiting out until next year and seeing where the things kind of lie is quite smart.
Lawrence, you had earlier mentioned Audi. Obviously, they're going to be on the grid here in the future. Who could you see Audi going after?
Probably all the names we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. If they could get any of those drivers in, they would. I think from the driver's perspective, you would have to be pretty convinced. I mean, Audi have already started on their engine project. They've been working on that for a little while, and seem to be quite confident about it. But remember, it's the Sauber Alfa Romeo team, Alfa Romeo as it's now called, that's going to be manufacturing the chassis and designing the chassis. And if you look at where Alfa Romeo is now, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get that car or that team in a championship contending place by 2026. Meanwhile, if you've got offers on the table from Red Bull and Mercedes and Ferrari potentially, those are much safer bets. So you'd have to be very convinced and swung by the bosses there. I mean, Andreas Seidel's there. He's obviously close to Lando, worked with him a long time at McLaren. So I think Seidel knows how good Norris is, probably would love to have him in the team. But I really do think it's going to be a case of seeing where all the other options end up. If Red Bull, there's no options there, or Norris doesn't fancy it because he doesn't want to go up directly against Verstappen in that team, then maybe Audi could be a good option compared to McLaren. But I think what we'll see is actually rather than deals being done now, I imagine we'll have a lot of drivers kind of, just waiting it out and just seeing how things develop and who they can talk to.
I think we'll see, won't we, how... Sorry, Katie, we'll see how serious Audi is about... obviously, it's serious because it's entering Formula One, but it was really impressive when Lawrence Stroll put all that money on the table for Fernando. And it was like, this is, I'm deadly serious about how much I want to win. I think Audi... if they get to 26 and they've kind of got a pretty, unexciting driver lineup, I think immediately you look at it and you say, okay, well, you weren't willing to really go after some of these drivers. And as Lawrence said, you couldn't convince them of the project. So I think a Norris would be interesting there with the Seidel link. I mean, he's worked with Sainz before. I think if we get a few more years of Ricciardo and he doesn't end up at Red Bull, I think for Audi, if he's still as marketable then as he is, if he still wants to race, I mean, he'll be like 30, 35 then. Fernando's shown you can do that. Lewis has shown you can do that. I think he's an outside bet as well. So a lot of interesting options for these guys.
Last rumor I'll hit you with. Alex Albon was allegedly courted by Red Bull and AlphaTauri, but turned them down. Lawrence, would you like to unpack that one?
I'm not sure about that one. I hadn't seen that story, but it may be the case that Alex is stuck in his Williams contract, which I think is the case, which is a multi-year deal starting this year, I think. So he's at least until the end of 2024. And we saw it with George Russell as well. When he had a Williams contract, I think there was a willingness from both Mercedes' side and obviously George's side to maybe get him out of that a year early. And they just couldn't find a way to make it happen. So he had to wait until 2022 to get in the Mercedes. And so if Alex is turning it down, I don't know whether that's actually him turning down or whether he just can't get out of that contract that he's in. I don't think Williams is a bad place at all for him to be. I mean, certainly compared to AlphaTauri, I think, it's arguably a more interesting place to be. He can be a team leader. That team is fully behind him. He's their talisman at the moment. It's all, very positive there for Alex, and he's getting some great results out of it. I think in James Vowles, they've got a team principal who's making all the right decisions at this stage, but those decisions will not bear fruit for another probably year at least. Realistically, it's going to be even longer than that before those decisions start to really make a difference to results. So, it's a position where, look, if Alex was offered a Red Bull drive, you can guarantee he'd be trying to find ways to get into it. But an AlphaTauri drive, which is perhaps what that rumor's about, I don't know, like I said, I haven't seen it, then maybe, maybe Williams isn't actually such a bad place to be.
Nate, if Audi were to offer Alex Albon a contract, would you consider them serious about their efforts and endeavors?
Yeah, I think so. Right now, Alex has been so impressive. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe not as serious
Why are
as
you
as
laughing,
Charlotte or
Lawrence?
Max.
No, it's just I like that you're throwing it back to Nate and whether
No,
you
it's good. You got to hold me
have
accountable for the
serious
nonsense I say
proposition.
on here. It's good, Casey. No, I think so. I think you've got to have you've got to have an exciting lineup, and I think Alex right now is one of the most exciting drivers on the grid. You know what he's doing in that Williams, and I think that he's a great example. And it's already been mentioned that we've got Sainz, Gasly, Albon. It's a reminder that when Red Bull gets rid of these guys, often they're good enough to stay in F1. They're just not quite good enough, maybe in the eyes of Helmut Marko, to stay, within that program. So on Albon, from what I understand, last year there was interest from both Alpine and Haas to get him. I don't think he was top of the Alpine list. I think that it was Gasly top of that list, but they know they spoke to Albon and his people. I know Haas looked at it as well, but that Williams contract is pretty tight. So, it is good for him to be there, but he may have limited his options a little bit. But I think actually, if he keeps performing in this way, then he's in a great spot. And I think that coming out of this contract he's in, whenever he's ready to talk to other teams, I think he's going to be in a great spot. So whether he's turned down Red Bull, I agree with Lawrence. I don't quite think that's the case, but he probably would have turned down the chance to go back to AlphaTauri, because I think for him it's a bit of a dead end. I don't know what you're going to prove there that you didn't prove to Helmut Marko already. They've already got rid of you once. Why go back in that same situation? So, but I think Albon, I really think Albon is kind of low, just simmering away. His performances are great. I think that he's easy to work with. He's got a great reputation in the paddock. I think there's a lot of teams that will be interested in him. And if jigsaw pieces start moving around, I think Albon's going to be in there somewhere.
I want to switch gears really quickly to the 2026 regulations, because Christian Horner and Max Verstappen have recently made comments that they are concerned for the new engine regulations and concepts that are coming in 2026. Lawrence, in a digestible manner, can you please just state for us what these changes and regulations are all about that we can expect in 2026?
Technical regulations are never that digestible. That's part of the issue. But I can give you the basic outline. So the engine bit, the V6 turbo, is largely staying the same, although they are removing the MGUH. But I won't go into the details of what the MGUH does because it's irrelevant going forward. And what you're going to have is that V6 turbo engine and a hybrid system, essentially, like in a Toyota Prius or something, and a hybrid system. But the hybrid system, rather impressively, is going to produce 50% of the power that the Formula One car produces. And they're looking at similar figures to now, so north of 1,000 brake horsepower. So at the moment, the hybrid system is just above 20%, around that area. So to go up to 50% is significant. And obviously it requires a huge amount of engineering. The other major factor is that we're moving from fossil fuels, so fuel based on oil, to renewable fuels. And so that is in itself a fairly big challenge as well. Now, it's really the 50% electrical, 50% internal combustion engine ratio that Red Bull seem to have an issue with. They think that basically that every car is going to run out of electrical power to deploy around the lap. We do see that occasionally, even under the current regulations, where you'll hear about drivers talk about clipping, which is basically where the car is regenerating energy at the end of straights, and sometimes they lose a bit of electrical power and it feels like the car's slowing down all of a sudden. So we've heard about that before when they push hard in races. Well, Red Bull is suggesting that that's going to be on a completely different level in the new set of regulations, to the point that they'll actually be using the engine almost as a generator to feed the battery. So they'll be downshifting at the end of the straights to create higher revs to feed electrical energy back into the battery, which doesn't seem like the most sensible way of going about it. But and on top of that, we don't yet have the chassis regulations confirmed that are going to pair with these new engine regulations. Now, the aims of the chassis regulations, I mean, chassis is probably the wrong word, but the aero regulations as well, is to reduce drag, which will make these cars more efficient. Therefore, you might solve some of those issues you have with the 50% electrical, 50% internal combustion ratio, and also make them lighter. But that's hard when you're basically going to need more battery capacity, significantly more battery capacity than you had before, and the batteries are very heavy. So you've got all these kind of factors playing against each other. And the other problem, and this is something that Max Verstappen has relayed is that if you reduce drag, you're probably going to reduce how exciting the races are, because the drag on a car, obviously it's something which all the teams are trying to remove as much as possible. But that creates the possibility for slipstreaming. So you get behind another car, you reduce the drag on your car, and then you can overtake on straights into braking areas and so on. And so they're looking at ways of making these cars super efficient with drag, which might involve something similar to what we have currently, which is a drag reduction system, but have it working all around the lap and also on the front wing as well as the rear wing. So basically active aerodynamics, which change as it goes around the lap to get the most efficient lap time. And there's a concern that all this emphasis on efficiency and everything is actually going to have a negative impact on the racing. But it depends who you talk to. That's what Red Bull's saying, and Red Bull are saying that because they believe they are so advanced with their understanding of the new power units that they've come across these problems before anybody else, and they've run it in simulations, and they're worried that it's going to make for some dull racing. If you talk to Mercedes, they say there's no problems, and also they say that when these regulations were first devised, there was always going to be this element of fuel burning to result in more electrical power, and there was no issue with that among the engine companies, because we have this sustainable fuel. So even though it sounds a bit wasteful, the fact that this fuel is not based on any type of fossil fuel, it's entirely already made in a lab, therefore it's not an issue. So you've got all these conflicting views, and as ever with a regulation change, it's hard to know who to trust, because each team obviously wants to succeed under the new regulations, and each team will have some idea roughly of where they are and where they want to be. And perhaps if Red Bull are starting to say, well, we should move to 55% power from the internal combustion engine, 45% from the electrical system, is that because they're worried about the efficiency of their electrical system and how they're going to generate power from it? Meanwhile, if Mercedes is saying, no, don't touch the rules, does that mean they're ahead? That would be a logical assumption to come to. It's very hard to know without knowing what their dyno results are and getting a look inside the engine factories and seeing whatever they're doing. But the other theory, which is the Red Bull theory, is that Red Bull are ahead and therefore know more about the pitfalls of these new regulations. Either way, it's going to be a bit of a political bum fight over the next probably few weeks or months, really, because decisions have to be made, because this is for 2026. And really, if you're going to start to make changes about, where the power's coming from in these engines, you need a decision fairly soon. So there you go.
Based on the conflicting responses, well done, by the way. I'll give you a 7 out of 10. Do you think that's fair for digestible?
I think
information.
7, 8.
7, 8. Okay, 7, 8.
I'll
bump you up to an 8.
Above average. Yeah. That's...
above average. Because of these conflicting responses, right, from Mercedes and Red Bull, Nate, read between the lines for me here. Is this a tactic by Red Bull to stay on top, or do we actually have legitimate concerns over how these new regulations will impact F1 moving forward?
I think you seem to get this. It's like a cycle, isn't it? Like every time there's a new regulation change, you have people coming in saying this is the worst. This is it's going to kill Formula One. It's going to be this. It's going to be that.
Sky's falling.
Yeah, and Horner and it's almost become. It's like the next chapter of the Horner Wolf kind of mudslinging contest as well. I'm sure there's valid. These are much smarter people than me. See that, by the way. Yeah, I mean, same. I mean, I think Vegas. That's how they should kick off. It's just be those two mud wrestling. And then the race starts right after that. That'd be fantastic. I don't know why I went mud wrestling. That was a weird, maybe a weird glimpse into my brain. I don't know.
Oranges to oranges. All the same.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know. Lawrence is much better at digesting the technical side to me. I find all of this after a while, it just gets really tedious because it's so far down the line. I think most fans, if they're brutally honest about it, don't really either care or understand enough to really get it. And I think it's just a lot of it's just grandstanding between different manufacturers about this. I think ultimately when we get to 26, I think things will be okay. One team will be ahead, the other teams will be behind, and then they'll all be in the same situation. You'll have the team that's second or third suggesting, well, maybe we should change the rules, and then the team out in front saying, no, the rules are the rules, we all signed up to them, and everything will continue as normal. It's kind of the cycle we get into. So I know it's important stuff, especially with the fuels that they're moving onto and stuff like that. But I think what Drive to Survive has shown is that really the compelling thing for a lot of people is the people kind of in these arguments rather than maybe some of the more technical things. So hopefully Formula One can find a way to resolve some of these debates. But I think ultimately, whenever you hear Horner or Wolff talk, you've got to take both with a pinch of salt because they're massively self-interested. And that's not a knock on those two. I think to succeed in Formula One, you have to be. So you just got to let it play out. And someone's always unhappy going into a rule change. Someone's always like, this rule change doesn't suit us, or, we've been screwed over in some way. It's happened every single time I can remember there being a rule change. And I think it's just part of the circus. It's part of what's compelling about it. But the further into it you get, the more you just start to think, well, it's so far away as well. I mean, we're still 2.5 years out from it. So for a lot of people, I think it's difficult to really buy either team are really that knowledgeable about what's going to happen, even if they are, they're working on these projects already. But for them to, I mean, Max was already talking about what, a lap of Monza is going to look like. It's 2.5 years out. This is technology they'll be working on a lot. So I think things will look a lot different, even a year from now when they're talking about this. So, yeah, I mean, let's just go straight to the mud wrestle and get all the engine stuff out of the way. That's what I would do. But again, that's why I'm not running F1 at the moment.
I think you'd get a decent amount of votes, and it's just as important as obviously rule changes and regulations. It's Martin Brundle's beefs with other human beings on the grid. If you've been living under a rock, Nate, can you please explain what went down with the Martin Brundle drama? And has anyone done a wellness check? Is he all right? Is he feeling good about how things went down?
I think he's always fine. I think he's just, things just bounce off of him. It was Cara Delevingne, wasn't it, who was on the grid. And he approached her and tried to get an interview. And I think she was with
Alfa Romeo?
Alfa Romeo, yeah. And whoever the team representative, who I don't actually know the name of, was with Cara Delevingne, basically said to Martin, no, you can't talk. Can't talk to her. And then she kind of said, I can't hear you. She was kind of joking around about it and said, I can't talk to you. And to be honest, I'll be completely honest with you. We don't see these things when we're at the races. We're on the grid, but a lot of this passes us by. So a lot of people message me like, the Brundle thing. Heard so much about this Martin Brundle moment. He was so rude, or she was so rude. Like everyone was. I saw it and I was like, that seems to me to be a perfectly, like, it was one person saying, can I interview you? She said no. And then she said, I can't really hear what's going on. And then he just made, it wasn't even a sarcastic comment. It was like, I'm sure it would have been interesting anyway. I didn't see the problem at all. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm desensitized to Brundle. But I think it was, there's this whole thing of, if you're on the grid, you should have to talk to Brundle. It's part of the entertainment, that he tries to talk to people. Sometimes he has great interviews. Sometimes he has very awkward ones. The ones we talk about usually are these ones, the ones that don't go so well, like the Megan Thee Stallion in Austin. That was if you ask me a Martin Brundle grid walk, I think of her saying, I don't have a rap today for you, Martin, and him kind of walking off, a bit sassily. So I think it's great for F1, even if people have maybe framed it as an anti-Martin thing or an anti-Cara Delevingne thing. I think that it's part of the show, and I think he's fine, and I think that it makes more people want to watch the grid walk, because you might miss, or him just thinking someone's Patrick Mahomes when it's not him. It's all brilliant. Even if beautiful moment. But I don't know. I mean, and again, I didn't see it live, so maybe at the time it seemed a lot worse. But it just seemed like an awkward moment, and two people that clearly had very different briefings on what to expect from the other person, or expectations when they were there. So I don't know.
I thought it was just like a typical English exchange between two people. I mean, sarcasm is you guys at your finest, right? So it was just two quips back and forth at each other. I thought it was funny. I didn't get worked up about somebody being rude to the other. Lawrence, what did you think?
That's most English guys approaching a girl at a bar. That's how it usually tends to go. I can't hear anything. I can't hear you. And then you're like, okay, say something sarcastic, move on. That's usually how it goes. I know in American films it goes a lot better, but in Britain, that's basically it.
Not really.
It's a fairly good analogy. It was slightly passive aggressive, I think, like, the way Martin walks away. But I think Sky have been told that from now on, celebrities who are on the grid, you can go and talk to, and they've been briefed that they should talk to you. So there was clearly just a miscommunication through perhaps through Alfa Romeo, perhaps through F1, and perhaps to Sky. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's the beauty of live television like that, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, to have potentially anything can happen. You're on the grid of a Formula One race. We've seen drivers before, tell Martin that they're not willing to talk, brush him away, stuff like that. He doesn't even bother approaching Lewis anymore, hasn't done for years, because he knows that there's absolutely no chance Lewis is going to talk to him. So I don't know. I think it's something that would make me want to tune in, just because I kind of enjoy watching slightly awkward moments like that, but I wouldn't get particularly upset from either side. And I'm sure neither individual really took it to heart too much. But I think it's one of those things that on social media can gather its own pace, and people can
for sure
read into it in their own little ways, and kind of, make wider judgments about characters. But yeah, I mean, really, it was just a misunderstanding.
And that's kind of why that's become it's why it's become such a famous thing, isn't it? Is because it is unscripted, and it's just you've got quite
unbelievable TV.
It's brilliant.
Go back on YouTube. There's one with Ozzy Osbourne, which is absolutely fantastic. There's one with John Bon Jovi where Martin keeps quoting his songs back to him until he gets really annoyed and just walks off. And then, of course, there's the famous Kimi Räikkönen one in Brazil where Michael Schumacher was retiring from the sport, and Martin for the first time. And Martin asked Kimi whether he'd been to Michael's retirement do at the front of the grid, and the answer is very good, but I'll let you go and find it yourself, because I don't think I can repeat it on the podcast.
Yeah, go find it yourself. I will say, what he does is extremely difficult for people who are not in television to be able to do what he does and have all of that be unscripted and to just fly by the seat of his pants as well as he does. It is excellent TV. I also think if you're going to be on the grid, you're fair game. If you're being invited to attend this sporting event, you're fair game if you're going to be out there. If you don't want to be spoken to, stay up in a suite. That's kind of how I feel about it. So I will tell you both. Yeah.
That's quite a good, I think that's quite a good line to use. I can't hear anything. Like, how can you argue against that? You're like, oh yeah, maybe. I mean, they were playing Spice Girls as loudly as they could.
As they should.
All pre-race. Yeah, as they should. I think Christian Horner had asked them to play it just beforehand. But yeah, so I think that's, as going forward, if you're a celebrity, you don't want to talk to Martin, just say you can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Easy.
Good cover. I will tell you both that I'm glad I got to have this conversation with the two of you today, because I found it to be very interesting. And I know that all of our conversations in the future will be interesting. Enjoy your weekend off. We'll be back, obviously, with more previewing the Hungarian Grand Prix coming up on July 23rd. Remember, subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content and give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate you listening, watching. I appreciate you both. Have a great week, guys.